hi everyone. My name is Mel Bacon, but you can call me Mel. I'm a fourth year PhD student at Michigan State University. My research focuses on analyzing social media behavior, socio-linguistics, basically. Fun fact about me is I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, which is the last Caribbean island. So if you hear like an accent,
Hi everyone, I'm Jeffrey. I'm an undergrad at Columbia University in New York, and I guess because I'm an undergrad, my research is not like super deep, but I like to think about math and topology and machine learning. Fun fact about me, I guess since we're going about where we're from, I grew up in California, which is not very exciting, most populous state, but it's something.
So right now, we're gonna ask our panelists to introduce themselves. If you're comfortable telling us your pronouns, fun fact, and other than a fun fact, add something else that's interesting about your research and what drew you into that area of study.
Hi, I'm Karolina Stańczak from University of Copenhagen, pronouns she, her. Yes, I'm doing my PhD in computer science and working on gender bias detection and with a bit more special focus on cross-lingual setups. So in my recent work, I've been analyzing the associations that language models made in regards to gender and in general how language and certain stereotypes and biases are then perpetuated through language to models of reasoning. A fun fact, about the research, but about me and my research, I would start with research. I think with regards to gender as a variable, what got me into the whole topic of gender as a variable, I think like a couple of years ago when I started my adventure as a young data scientist, I've been working for a bank. And there I was a student assistant that had to recalculate all the models because I actually knew law was enforced and that was not allowing anymore to use gender as a variable for credit scoring. So I was just sitting there and calculating all the logistic regressions again without gender as a variable, and then trying to look how the coefficients have changed and so on. And since then, that was quite interesting topic for me, and anyways, discrimination and ethical aspects of research for sure. This is years ago how gender starts to be something quite interesting and often used in maybe ways that are not really necessary. And fun fact about me, I don't know. I think I like to be happy about small things. Yesterday on the streets of Seattle, I complimented the sweater I knitted myself. Yeah, but that's
So hi everyone, I'm Beatrice Savoldi from the University of Trento and the Research Center. I'm a third year PhD candidate, which is also next year at full time. And so my general research interests encompass the social societal impact of language technology. In my PhD, more specifically, I've been working on gender bias in translation technologies. And I'm saying translation technologies and not machine translation because we're looking into that not only the textual modality, so translating from text into one language into another, but also for speech translation, so from audio into a target text translated, which is a big difference. And so during these 3 years, I've been working on constructing a benchmark to investigate finally gender translation from English into the multiple languages, and using that to also explore linguistic specificity in the study of gender bias, algorithmic choices to really influence gender bias, but also on drawing together sort of different disciplines for the study of this topic. Because so fun fact about my research is that at the background in AI or computer science. So I come from a Master of Arts in Translation Studies and Linguistics and Literature. But then I got interested into how language technologies process human language. And so I did an internship with this machine validation group I'm still working with at FBK, because occasionally they need linguists and translation students that know languages to evaluate the systems, not only technicians to develop core technologies. And they suggested various topics I could work on, and I picked the one on gender bias. And yeah, and then at the beginning it was kind of framed as a cross-lingual issue, because different languages mark gender in a different way. So if you're working from English, maybe you only have some gender terms or pronouns, particularly gender, but my mother tongue Italian and many others, we have morphological inflections on verbs, articles, adjectives, nouns, and so forth. And then you may have one of many problems. A student will be mapped to binary definition for masculine and feminine. But then the more I work on that, and then the more I realize that there's more systemic issues beyond transition, impacting the whole field of technologies, and more related to societal issues. And this was a lens that you could get from many different disciplines, not sociology of technology. And so I decided to stick on that and keep on working for my PhD. And fun fact, I'm really bad at those. But since you were talking about location, I would say the fun fact is that I'm very jet lagged, and this is about my bedtime right now. So yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Arjun. I use they them pronouns.
She, her pronouns are forgot.
We also forgot ours. So, but it's
Yeah, so I just finished my first year of my PhD at UCLA, and my interests are in the auditing of data sets with a focus on networks, something like social networks, citation networks, and also natural language. So some stuff that I've thought about / worked on in the past include what are some ways in which bias in a very vaguely defined is captured within network structure and then can be translated into harms downstream. What about the presence of neopronouns in wiki data? Like so, like if you were to dump a bunch of Wikipedia text, like what percentage of that is neopronouns? Are we even conceptualizing and operationalizing NLP tasks in a way that makes sense? What about graph tasks? So just kind of a lot of different questions about the ways that we're constructing and using data sets related to networks and natural language. So I guess a fun fact about me personally is I really enjoy hiking, and I think my most favorite hike was one I did in Kerala. We were walking into like a leech-infested forest, and I was like, whoa, that's so cool. The leech is sucking my blood. I was like, shit, the leech is sucking my blood. So I was just like taking like leeches off my body. That was very weird. And I think like the research path is that I think honestly I wouldn't be doing this kind of research or as interested in this area if it weren't for Queer and AI. Like this organization has been like extremely transformative for me in so many ways. Like I found so many intersections of my advocacy and research. And yeah, I totally would not be a researcher right now if it weren't for the support structures provided to me by this organization. So I'm very grateful.
Really quickly, he, him pronouns. I did forget that before. I think that is necessary.
Yeah, and then I use they them pronouns. Yeah. Okay. I guess with that out of the way, we can get into some of the questions for gender as a variable. So I know everyone kind of touched on this a little, but we were kind of wondering when you actually do research with gender in NLP or gender in any sort of computational context, what are some of the ethical ramifications when it comes to either manually annotating or going back and reviewing annotating? And what are some of the discussions that you have with that come up about?
Okay, so as a general introduction, I think that there's no a single good way to use gender as a variable and annotate data. I think it really depends a lot on the research questions. So for instance, if you're looking into people's biases, you may even just use a picture and see if people decide to use our oversimplistic view on gender and recognize the gender of the person by how they're dressed and how they look, for instance, or it's like what Karolina was working on at the previous work of hers. You want to see if a model is skewed towards some sort of more male sounding, feminine sounding, more ambiguous names to assess credit worthiness. And then there could be a variable that is important to you. But then, of course, it's not reliable. Names are not reliable gender information, we all know, not only because of, not only for creating fields, but also for cross-lingual differences. So, a typical example is the name Andrea, which is feminine, for female sounding for many languages. The speakers, for instance, in Germany, but like in Italy, it's more male sounding instead. And then in my work and with my group, we look a lot into gender linguistic artifacts rather than people's identity. So in general, we've been working on annotations on gender forms. So if we have this parallel data from English into grammatical gender language, we would annotate the form in which it is inflected in this translation. But then we also at a certain point wanted to annotate those instances in which you have a speaker uttering a sentence like, I am a student. And you maybe wanted to double check whether the gender sounding translation reflected that the speaker would want. And to do this and stick with linguistic artifacts, since we were working with dead thoughts, we were lucky enough to have the biographies of the speakers with their pronouns, and so we could check whether this mapped. And this also reveals some very interesting cross-lingual issues. So in our set, we only found one day speaker, but it was translated with inflected masculine forms by the translator. And we looked into it, and it was because the speaker was defined themselves as transgender there, for instance. So in this case, we could also cross-check the mapping of forming one language and another, and also get these kinds of nuances coming from cross-lingual differences.
Yeah, in my case, it's a bit different because, yes, I think the topic of my PhD is gender bias detection. So, in a way, I should be already on the ethical side, but I think what we as a field in gender biasing and gender detection should be aware of, that only because we're supposed to be on the ethical side, it doesn't mean automatically that everything we do in Syria is then just ethical because we want it to be. So we still need to reflect on exactly how we define gender if we're analyzing what is bias indeed, and then reflect on the definitions we use and the methods we use. And in my research, I've been using data annotation about real people, and then I was doing Wikidata, and obviously there's the question: can we 100% rely on the database? And obviously, because it can be manually changed by users, there is not 100% certainty that what we're using is actually completely accurate. And we do need to, in a way, of course, rely on the fact that the community is making efforts to ensure the quality of the database and what we're using, but obviously also in future research, just to have it in mind that a lot of what we do there is basically everything is ethical issue. Even just using gender as a variable poses an ethical issue.
I want to definitely plus one the things that Karolina and Beatrice said. I think in addition to that, I think there's like 3 different things that are on my mind, and I'll try my best to articulate it decently clearly. One is on, like, I think machine learning practitioners need a better education and measurement modeling. Like, it's like something that's very common in social sciences, where you're going out and constructing your own data sets and thinking about what proxies are you using to infer unobserved constructs like gender, race, etc. So I think so much can be gained from machine learning researchers basically recognizing that gender is not some kind of truth. Like the way that we say people are men or women, or the discretization of these things, or even the way people self-describe, is never going to fully capture their identities. Identity is so complex, and these are just our ways of conveying ourselves to others, and also the ways that people in power try to put us in categories for the sake of their own projects, whether it be surveillance, data colonialism, etc. So yeah, recognizing that certain things are proxies they're never going to be like how someone feels inside about their gender. The other thing is about the multiplicity of gender. Gender essentialism runs rampant in our community. We always think that like sex assigned at birth is gender expression, is gender identity, is gender in like social roles. And I think we could do a lot by having more paragraphs like in our papers. There's a very small starting point, but explaining what aspects of gender you're even considering. Does it make sense to just like say gender bias is a thing without explaining gender or bias? Like not really. Like we should be talking about, we have gender occupation bias, a huge thing that we have in our research. What aspect of gender are you considering there? Because what jobs I might apply to is heavily shaped by my identity. But whether or not I get a job, for example, is heavily shaped by how people perceive me, right? Based on my gender and their assumptions. So a lot of things to think about there. And then just kind of reiterating what Karolina said about, yeah, I feel like people in our field, like bias and fairness has been used to create almost this like veneer of ethics and fairness. And oftentimes that stuff usually doesn't work. Like we operationalize fairness and bias in all these ways, like mostly parity based. But what is fair to me or what's unbiased to me is not what is fair or unbiased to someone else. And then also the thing that Vagrant had mentioned in the previous panel, we often don't ask whether we should be building certain things with respect to gender. And that's another conversation that I think I have with my lab mates, probably more often than I should. Like, is gender really like relevant here? Like, to what end are you using gender? Are you using gender just because it's available to you? Have you thought about the implications of using gender, etc.? Yeah, there needs to be a better connection of bias to harms. Truly, like people need to be thinking more in terms of harms and less in terms of like gender bias, and that will kind of move us closer to maybe the point where people don't build things because there's no way to de-bias like a gender classifier or whatever, right?
I think of one thing you reminded me of talking about it, because my background is actually in statistics, and gender and discrimination is always like the topics that were moving for me. But and as a computer, like in the field of computer science, often there is a hierarchy of what is valuable linguistic and NLP. I often have the impression that it's computer science, mathematical methods. Then there's level 2, it's linguistics, and then like on the bottom, maybe because we are analyzing language, there is some kind of societal impact to it, but I don't want to analyze it because cool maths is cool, and obviously it is, but we are still tackling issues that are so close to society, they're our society, and without doing our reading, or like at least I'm saying that also to myself from before and even now, without getting to know and researching on the societal aspect for what gender is in general, yeah, I feel like that's step number 1.
Thank you so much. Really, I would just like to add that I do have a background in computational social science, and I'm for a PhD student in computer science as well. But there needs to be a better and deeper intersection between society and building these language models and these to better capture what society is today. So you guys made some really great points about gender bias. So the next question is, there's a growing body, extensive body of research on gender bias today, and that gender bias is embedded in training data. And now that these deep learning large language models are becoming well known, there's little to no explainability on the allocational and representational harms caused by the deployment of these language models. So the question is, from a technical standpoint, how can we combat or mediate those harms in different stages of workflow?
All right, so first of all, don't think you can only do this from a technical point of view. I think really you need to think also about the context in which we are creating these models and in which they are deployed, because even if you have many technical decisions that can kind of deteriorate, let's say, the fairness or say stability of your model, you cannot change history, right? If you talk about data, you have to think about the context in which it's been generated and start with assumption. And not use it as an excuse for having bias training data, but some stuff you just cannot. Systemic issues of reporting about women and queer communities are just not going to disappear. But then I really like some recent work which has been coming out on auditing large language data. For instance, crawl language data for these large language models, they were showing how lists of words, of knowledge words, were actually disproportionately impacting queer communities, because maybe they were reclaiming minority communities racialized or sexualized slurs, or talking about issues like gay marriage, which would be sort of associated with negative feelings. But these kind of technical decisions, they always seem very neutral, right? We never take them into account. We talk about raw data as long as they're not annotated. Actually, when you're already using the internet is a source, or you're using an algorithm sort of filtering to all this stuff, you're already making decisions, and we're not really considering those as sources of bias. We're just taking everything, and then we start thinking about biases as something that starts later with annotation, which keeps on building up, but this is your starting point, I think.
Yeah, so I think I also want to comment on the technical, the standpoint thing. Yeah, I mean, for full disclosure, I was definitely on the technical train for a very long time. Like my stuff with like gender bias estimation algorithms. Like I contributed to like open source libraries for this kind of work. And yeah, I think more and more now, it's just the idea that you can go about like doing this from just a purely technological standpoint is so flawed, because there's so many factors along this pipeline that go into the bias. People are like biased only in the data, but then I think you can start even earlier and ask like, who has the intent of going about building these language models? Like if people look at it, like it's mostly the US and China. And so like these large language models already have so much, bias very vaguely defined baked in just from the people who are trying to build them for their own projects, where it's usually surveillance, like who's benefiting from these technologies, usually the people who are harmed are not the communities in mind, or people set out to make these systems. Yeah, and I think I also want to second the point about auditing, and I don't think there's any way to go about fixing problems in data, because many of them are extremely systemic, but I feel a lot of researchers would benefit from just sampling instances from their training data and going about annotating them, even in a qualitative manner, like trying to find patterns in their data. Like, to what extent do they see like issues with coverage, with validity, how I don't know, like how many errors are in the data set to begin with, like factual inaccuracies, annotator disagreements, like all these things. You like learn a lot from doing it. Like I only started doing some of this annotation stuff very recently, and I'm honestly shocked by like a lot of these super glue benchmark data sets that people are using. Yeah, and I think a lot of the stuff around bias, I guess like to answer the technical part a little bit, I think you can use some of these metrics to some extent to like try to identify potentially issues during deployment. I mean, I don't know, like you definitely have to involve communities that you have in mind, for if you have a very good conceptualization of which communities are being harmed, and then include them in every possible to come up with potential metrics to quantify harms. And that is only going to be 1% of the work that you have to do to continually monitor these systems. Yeah, bias doesn't just stop at the development part of the pipeline, and it definitely continues as the model is in full effect, and even after the model's done being deployed. Your Attila model, like the effects of that are still there, and I think we still have a lot of work to do in thinking about how like the imprint of this algorithm beyond deployment reifies a lot of problems with gender inequity, et cetera.
And yeah, I think I agree with everything that's been said. And just to add one thing, I feel like there's also like mismatch in like the group of people that is doing biasing, and then there's model development deployment. And I feel like there has been already so much wonderful work on the biasing. And I ask myself, is someone using it? I really do hope they are, but I don't know. And as long as it's completely detached, then are we just doing it for the sake of doing it, or are we really trying to devise the models? But yeah, I agree, because I mean, if like I work at universities, I'm not the one developing the models, then I feel like then obviously the biasing is much more efficient, or like makes more sense to bias in test processing, obviously, because this is like data I have good access, and I'm not going to bias. I can work on the biasing underlying data, but obviously that requires a lot of computational force. Obviously, we can try to look more into like downstream task performance, and then try to look for the biasing. It's obviously like, yeah, I can recall out just to, yeah, if someone using it, I hope so.
Thank you for all that. This next question is somewhat related to how models they will continue evolution on models themselves, because around the world now there's a lot of new movements to try to be more gender diverse, or I guess like go deeper into what is gender exactly. You see these sorts of movements across many languages, across many regions of the world. But research deals with already archived data, with wiki data, and that may not reflect like modern movements or form of language. How do you think researchers should deal with that? How do you think model development should deal with that?
I just put it out here and we just first became like sort of round.
Okay, so I think that to answer this question, we need to think about differently on the applications. Because like I said, for some applications, it's easier to try and at this iterative process where you can let different forms of information enter, and also depending on the data you're using. So if I'm thinking about a chatbot, you may have some sort of preference by the user can be inserted, or some intermediate iterative step to add new stuff, or if it's a genre working with social media data. So set of knowledge that social media platforms allow for more diversity, language change in general. First, because they're not very police in terms of the language you're using if you're writing an essay, and second, because young people are there, and young people are those that drive language change and language iteration the most. But things are really different depending on the kind of data you're using. So I'm thinking about saying translation data. So this takes a lot of time. You need someone after that, mostly those institutional stuff, and then someone translating it. And then about those with language changes, we need to make, I think we were discussing this before with Karolina, with our panel session before. You need to distinguish about the culture and the country that needs account, because the US in English is a leader of change in this sense, but definitely this is not the case for my home country and many other countries. And for instance, in a language like Italian with Untitled Chapter, there have been many testing courses, because for the last 20 years, there's been actually a strong attempt at bringing feminine forms into use for many occupational words. And also the issue there is not so much about pronouns, because we have a proto language where we don't really use them. So we wouldn't say he, she, they went, you know? So this is not our focus. And so we also have this bias actually coming from, let's say, pushes into English, which are admirable, but they're not very applicable maybe to other dynamics. And so going back to different courses, you have this attempted feminization, which is not complicated. Then now there's also these attempts starting to use direct non-binary language to give visibility to other communities, which I think also came into use a lot because of these movements coming from, this side of the world. In fact, there have been many discussion on non-binary language from translators in Italy also, like how do I deal with this when translating this book into our language? I don't know right now. So some linguistic creativity. And then there's also the issue of masculine genetics. So for a mixed group of people, you would use what is considered to be a generic form, but actually a masculine one. And so there you may want to use indirect language so rather than students infected with the masculine form, maybe student body. So you have all of this. So if you think about language generation tags, the thing is really about language diversity, but there's not a one-fits-all solution. It depends a lot on the application and the genre. But in general, I guess that why you have to do something, of course, you want to use this form in your technology. At the same time, it has to follow language. So language is a practice, community-based interaction. So you need for something to be adapted in a community and used before you can even think about how to discuss this with the community and insert in your application and recognize it in some way.
Yeah, I really liked everything that Beatrice said. But I kind of wanted to pick on the last part, like the community-based thing, because I think if we really want to move closer towards kind of going beyond these issues of scale that like lack context and all these ways in which language models are used for surveillance, et cetera, and don't really take into account people's identities or their language, we really do need to empower communities to develop AI on their own. I think like a lot of Western epistemology, especially kind of based around imperialism, centers like the large-scale collection of data, power centralization, et cetera. We're putting so much of this data in like data warehouses, and we're building, but very few people are building these models, and they're being used by a very small group of people. But now there are so many more movements that are coming about. Like the Maori people in New Zealand, there's a really great article about how we have these very predatory companies looking to buy their speech data to build a speech to text transcription service, but they refuse to sell their data because they were capable of developing their own transcription service. And they're so much more connected with how language is used in their communities. They know, I mean, they don't have to deal now with like these transcription services being trained primarily on like wiki data, right? Because they're empowered, they have the ability to collect their own data, create their own models, and not be the prey of like large tech companies. Yeah, so I think this is very prominent in a lot of other epistemologies, indigenous epistemology. They have this great paper, Indigenous Protocols in AI is a great paper that talks about shallow AI, and kind of how that's different from like deep or like powerful AI. So it's like you have these, it's very community oriented. You have communities building AI for themselves. The people building it are the ones who are impacted by it, are the ones who are using it. And we have DARE, with like to meet and Data for Black Lives and even Dava and all these other groups that are looking to solve local community issues through the use of artificial intelligence that has not been developed in a centralized manner. That isn't like Google coming out there and being like, hey, we're going to take your data and then we're going to build a model, and you might not get anything back from it, but whatever. And then like, that's just, it's just awful, like how things are transpiring with centralization of data and power. So yeah, just to summarize succinctly, it'd be nice to put AI and data back in the hands of local communities and grassroots organizations. And this is kind of probably the best way to go beyond the issues of like how large language models just like don't capture modern movements because they're so heavily influenced by those in power and those creating these hegemonic categorizations, et cetera.
Yeah, I can only say plus one to everything that has been said so far, and I feel like as NLP researchers, I mean, we should just actively listen and wait and see how language is being developed, or like it's developing itself and then through the people. And because obviously language is there to offer also some kind of generalization of like how we speak and general rules, but yeah, how it's developing, I mean, to embrace also small like minorities. It's just a wonderful change in the looking for.
Yeah, thank you all for those excellent answers. I think this next one was a question that it was very enlightening from the previous people. We were interested in your thoughts on it as well. Essentially, in a lot of works, and probably the vast majority of NLP research, gender is more so as a binary variable, as opposed to like an actual spectrum. And I guess the question here is like, how can these researchers begin to think of gender more of the spectrum, and how would you actually, I guess, apply that, or at least view it through the tools that we have now mathematically? And if that's not possible, any like particular mathematical directions or computer science directions, I think so that we can actually, I guess, study it that way. And then beyond that, like from the previous talk, should we study it that way? That's a lot.
Alright, there was,
Yeah, I just
there
wanna make
were
sure I
many points and there are many questions,
Yeah.
and sub-questions, so I'll try to see whether I can kind of touch on all of them. So, I don't know, was part of the question also why we're working on binary genders this much or not really?
I think so it's more of in NLP and the AI community that when gender bias is being tackled as a problem, gender is seen more as a binary problem and not as a spectrum. That gender is not binary. So that's one question. I think Jeffrey added 16 parts of some question.
So how can we move beyond that? That would be the
Yes.
summary of it. Alright, so again, before answering this question, what do we mean by gender, right? So are we talking about how we perceive gender, identity features of an individual, gender societal level, or gender linguistic artifacts, right? Because again, if you go back to gender linguistic artifacts, for me, it's no longer really about thinking on a spectrum, but rather as diversity, right? Like linguistic diversity, they were relying on our model, and how can we model this diversity? So I think there was this paper, which I think was very cool, that came out this year from Lauscher and colleagues from the Milano NLP lab. And they were basically mentioned as classical statistical modeling of packaging. We never allowed for the modeling of less frequent phenomena, which would be the case for a simple reason of neopronouns in their place in their study. Also because there's much diversity, people emerging, so you don't even have a compact form, just like standing against the use of he or she, for instance. And so, you have to look into other ways. And for instance, they mentioned this approach to lexicalization, which basically is the idea. So let's not make let's think about co-reference model without spurious forms of pronouns associated with a certain maybe proper name in the sentence. Let's replace the pronoun with posta, indicating the function, a third person singular, and let's see whether by abstracting in this way we can also manage our models to kind of handle new forms coming in. So this is a sort of approach. Then if you think about identity features, first of all, the question is always, do we really need to embed them in our models? Why would we want to use gender in this way? But if you want to do that, and maybe you're even working with self-identified gender data. So I'm not expert on this, but maybe we could look into some work more from age as a variable, because also there you don't have a binary system, right? It's more of phases, and also there you're kind of struggling with lived experience, a sort of framing for social age or date of birth with chronological, and you have to sort of identify, right, where does one phase which is relevant begin and ends. So maybe looking at these other types of variable and how they're being treated by some of these.
Yeah, so I guess I want to nitpick like a little bit of the question, and also, yeah, I guess it just depends on the language. I think part of the problem about trying to fix the gender issue in NLP is that we start off by saying like moving beyond binary gender, which in and of itself like kind of normalizes the idea there's binary gender and there's more that we can explore. Why does binary gender really have to be the starting point from which we actually look at it? And we have to radically reconstruct our relationship and view of gender. I don't really know what that's going to look like, to be honest, but yeah, there's also the point of from earlier about how I guess this kind of goes against everything else that I was going to say that I've said so far in this panel. but I kind of maybe hinted at that like gender is this like continuum. It's not like it's like so hard to even describe it. It's not like we as queer people, I think we like always try to talk about how unlabelable we are sometimes. Like we're so fluid and we're so our identities are so complex, and that's kind of like the basis of queerness, and therefore AI is super antithetical to like everything that our identities are. But to some extent, like we do put labels on ourselves, and we kind of enjoy meeting other people who are like, for example, like identify as bi. I'm like, oh, cool, you're bi too, like that's awesome. And then like with that kind of stuff in mind, there are some perspectives that people like want to be classified. Like we do benefit in a social manner from being classified. And I think the problem then becomes like who is doing the classification, who is coming up with the categories. So it's not about like moving beyond anything, because that implies that there's some kind of consistent thing that we're moving towards together, or that there is some starting point, but rather like radically reconstructing where we are right now, having a much better and much more grounded understanding of gender and sexuality. And that's not going to come from academia, that's going to come from the communities for whom you're building these systems. And then, yeah, just working with these communities very closely, forming a sustained relationship with them to get to the point where, in certain instances, like based on their needs, based on their values, based on the domain, based on the application, we're doing some level of classification and some level of like just not modeling certain things because they shouldn't be categorized. Yeah, that was a little bit all over the place. So it's kind of like it involves like just talking to people. Like we need to form sustained relationships with people because they know what they want. Like I don't know what anyone wants. I don't know that every single trans person wants this thing. So we need to just do more talking, more sustained relationships.
And I think also coming back to the previous panel, where it has been mentioned that it's just easy. There's a certain ease to binarism, especially as in computer science, binary problems are just fun. and we are just used to them. We have methods for them. So it is, and then obviously then again, if the data we use, as you mentioned, it's not updated or it's just partially there, and if it's just male and female, then we just go with the binary problem. Or if we see that there's not enough, or like there are just a few examples of people that don't fall into these two categories, then say it's not statistically significant. And I feel like I'm definitely also partially guilty. I'm statistician, I've seen no statistical significance. I'm like, okay. And I obviously that's something like lessons learned. I mean, there's a name behind every data point there. And maybe we should look into more, even if there's just a qualitative analysis, just to dig a bit deeper, not just to mention in the paper. Yeah, we do realize that gender is not binary, but well, and just to have the sentence in the paper to show that we actually do accomplish that, to show that we did our homework, but we actually didn't if we don't do maybe we have to do right. So like it shouldn't be mentioned there just for the sake of mentioning. I tried, but it didn't work. But maybe trying still a bit more. It's also for myself.
Yes, thank you so much. So we have 15 minutes left, I believe. We have like 72 more questions, so let's be patient. So I think we could probably ask one more question and then open up for everyone to ask questions, because I'm sure everyone is really probably interested in what you guys all have to say. So the last question would be, how do you see your work with gender evolving in the future? Like, for example, what are some key pushes in that field that you're occurring today? And what are some ethical ramifications that may come from the previous work while learning as learning from today moving forward? You guys mentioned that language is evolving. Gender pronouns are being added every day. There's people behind these languages, these names, these pronouns. So how do you see yourself moving forward from this talk? This question right now.
Alright, so I guess for me there are three aspects that I really would like to further explore. And I think that these three aspects also reflected in our meeting. I think they're being more addressed and more taken into account by the community in general, which are first of all more inclusivity in the way we treat gender as a variable, especially as a in this field right now, I'm interested in variability in gender expression in language, and also this one, the previous one especially, which was definitely about this too. Then I'm very much interested and concerned with cross-cultural differences, right? Because also when we invent gender and we should come up with language, stereotypes even, we always work only with occupational stereotypes, but they want to generalize maybe to some extent to the Western hemisphere, but what about the other languages? There was this very cool work on Turkish gender translation. We always look on translation from a less gender marked language into a more gender marked one. But in this case, instead, they were translating from English, looking at pronouns like gender words in English, like sister and brother, going into Turkish, which is supposedly genderless. But then for brother, you get something close to sibling in Turkish, but for sister, female sibling, right? So this is a sort of over bias where you treat the masculine form as more of the default, which you don't specify, but then you over specify the feminine one or whatever else you might get in this case. The system commercial one was going this way. And so this is something that we don't think about if you consider other types of languages and cultures. So I think this is very, very interesting. And also how gender intersects with many other variables, right? And social class, economic status, case in other cultures. We don't think about this. I don't think about this. So I think it's very interesting. And it's more cultural inside the sales, so it's really reflecting this ACS 6 and 6 initiative. And then another thing I'm very concerned about, interested in is more human interaction approaches to technologies. I'm very interested in how any type of solution or step you're taking is perceived by the end users. And again, in my specific field, which is technologies, we have different users. We have people that don't speak the language being translated, at least not one of them, and we have translators. And whatever you're suggesting is a sort of mitigating approach, I think is going to look very different for a translator and from someone who's using maybe MT just to get the gist of stuff and can really double check on your output, and also how are we influencing their sort of way in which they perceive language and language practices. I think the very exemplary for this was the case of the work feature of inclusive language released by Google for it's called Google Documents, and apparently according to the media was this backlash because people didn't like when the system was suggesting not to use mankind as humankind, and this or not to use so police officer instead of policemen, right? And apparently people felt like they were being policed. They didn't like that. I don't know the specifics how this was presented, if it was like an optional feature you could use or not. But in general, definitely if you want, like language is very personal as a practice. And definitely you need the feedback of the user to try to sort of understand if you're going in the right direction, because at the end of the day, it's for them that you should be developing these technologies. So yeah, these are my 3 points.
Yeah, this is a really nice question. I think I think a lot about the work that I've previously done with like binary gender bias. And I think it's always, I think going forward, I'm always like happy now to like just kind of look back on it and be like, wow, that was really a time, and I've like grown so much since then. Even like I noticed in talks that I've given in the past or panels I've been on, like my language has changed so much, like the way I refer to these topics from like month to month. So, you're always constantly learning. I think going forward, I want to keep on doing advocacy work with Brain AI because I feel like that has really shaped the way that I navigate these issues in the context of AI. Like, again, my experience as a trans person is not monolithic. So it's not like I have so much privilege, so many ways, like caste privilege, I have so much socioeconomic privilege. Like I present very masculine And so I'm just like almost very naturally included in a lot of AI spaces, but to talk to like trans value folks, or just any other kind of intersections of identities, it just really makes it adds complexity to what the trans experience is, and that really shapes how I approach artificial intelligence systems. I also want to do more research where I try to like seek out communities who are not usually thought of when you kind of deploy these systems, because I think Os made this really excellent point earlier. They said that like the harms that we know of are the harms we hear about, and you can't really hear harms from people who we don't see as people. And so like if we are not envisioning these folks, we're not thinking about them, we don't learn about the harms that they face. There's so many people who are beyond like my understanding of the effects of my models. And so I want to do a lot of survey work, a lot of interviews, try to learn like who is being affected and what do they want. Because yeah, I want to better ground my work in care work. I'm kind of moving beyond this idea of like harm reduction is enough. I want to build things because I love the people in my community and I love like everyone in this world, and I want to do things that positively impact them instead of just telling them that, well, I'm not going to harm you today. I'm going to keep on keeping power structures in place and benefiting those who have the money and the power to like make these systems.
Yeah, for me, I think there are two directions I like to go forward. It's similar to Beatrice. I think also just because we come from Europe, from different languages and English being our mother tongue. So for me, like cross-lingual aspects, it's not everything applicable to English. And just once one translated to other languages, and there are so many aspects to how bias or like how language in general work in other languages, if they're more gendered or not. And I find it completely fascinating how languages in general work. And then I guess a nice part about this event and the community in general, being, or for me, analyzing gender bias. There's no way, or like as a gender woman, I just need to be also in the community of queer and AI to listen to people and not to neglect anything or like just to listen, be aware and to see the harvest is
Thank you guys so much on talking about how to conceptualize gender and talking about gender as a whole and NLP. So guys, would you give the panelists we do have about 7 more minutes. So if anyone wants to ask questions, please feel free to do so. Raising your hand.
I have a question that like I also asked on last time, so someone else can go first if someone else has one.
I think you're first in line.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. So a lot of this panel has definitely been about like, you know, throw gender out, think about it differently. But at the same time, language models are still, we're not even doing binary gender well. Like language models are still, you know, they're still saying women are bad at math, women are bad at science, women should be mothers, you know. And I don't really want a language model saying those things about me. And so I'm wondering how you all think the research community should balance more like short-sighted, imperfect harm reduction work with the more long-range, difficult, and like theoretical reconstruction work.
Okay, so you're completely right. We're not even doing binary gender models, but not only the models, but even we have researchers defining it and using it. So it's really not clear most of the times when we mean gender in papers. When I was doing a survey, it took me really a while to find and classify the papers I was reading to put them in the survey because it was really not clear how they meant it. If they implied that, for instance, it was something like a typically feminine way of speaking in general, or if they were talking about infections, right? So I think it's a really hard question to think about short. I don't think they are exclusive. I think they're, so you were mentioning short-term intervention and long-term ones. I don't think they have to be separated. I think they're part of the same thing. In general, I think that, however, for it now, practice documenting has been of vital importance because at least you're aware of the problems that are going to be there. So now we have data sheets for data sets, model parts, the statements, and recently the CL. There's also been a presentation of data sheets for ICAS by Said, I don't remember the journal right now, I'm really sorry. And this is basically researcher did it on emotion detection. So going through all the pitfalls of the definition of what emotion detection, can we do this? If we can, what do we mean by that? Are we inferring emotional states or emotional words, for instance? And so these kind of helps you out in understand what's going on and try and take a more positive stance within this very complex and sensitive and changing attributes. These at least for, if you want the short term, it's also gonna impact the long one. And starting from this, at a certain point, you can also, again, if you think about with previous panel, think about, do I really want to develop this task? Do I really want to release it? How am I going to deploy it? With some kind of information for the user or not really? So I think, at least in this sense, documenting and informing and being aware is something you can do now that's also going to impact future research. I don't know if this makes sense.
Yeah, this is a very nice question as well. Something I've been kind of grappling with, like to kind of do this work on binary gender bias and do bias mitigation stuff. To some extent, like I worry that we're reinforcing the systems that are in place for things like surveillance, right? Because like, who is building the models? Are they just, do they actually care about bias, or are they just using these things as a way to cover up the fact that kind of an ethics washing almost, like these models aren't ethical because they apply these algorithms. I do think there's two prongs to kind of ways to make the current models better. So I agree with Beatrice that transparency and documentation is super important. I really honestly love the NeurIPS like checklist from this past year, where they make you like, they ask you like to postulate like what your limitations of your model are, and it gets you to think. Like I think being transparent about what you think the pitfalls of your model are is like a very good starting point, because to be honest, a lot of the metrics mitigation strategies won't really work in the real world. So at least like knowing what the problems are and being more aware of your positionality, et cetera, is good. Yeah, I think the other thing along these lines is like just, I think we need to change our curriculum. Like I know this is like, it's actually like it seems radical, but it's a relatively small intervention to kind of go to universities and at least make people take like one class on gender or like one class on queer theory, because it really shaped my perspective to like take one of these classes. I mean, actually, it's a small intervention. I'm full disclosure, in my school, UCLA is just like absolutely doing a shitty job at this. Like, they don't really consider diversity and inclusion as like part of ethics, because of course, you know, a white field like AI decided to go to philosophy for ethics, which is an even more white and male field. But yeah, we need to do a better job. I think like it's not enough to just have transparency and metrics and mitigation strategies. People also need to care, because otherwise we lead to like ethics washing problems and like false ideas of like what models are capable of, et cetera. Like, it's so important to have these classes, because that's how you really write mission statements.
Something short in this. I think on this point, and you're completely right. So I've been visiting the University of Groningen in the Netherlands this semester, and I've been working with Professor in SIM for designing this course for bachelor students in information science on ethical aspects in NLP and technologies. And the feedback we got was very much about, I've been so used to coding all the time, never thought about critical questions and reflecting. And on the idea of having enough questions, I cannot just answer right now. So this was very so I completely different bias, you know, like you open lots of problems and maybe just really say, you know, think about solutions. But the thing here is very solution driven. But sometimes it's about asking the right questions and being doubtful and reading and thinking and reflecting. And from what I've seen, it's definitely not really part of necessarily right now.
You mentioned also that how can we do this short term? And I feel like a lot has been already done in terms of devising methods for binary gender categories of gender. We just need to really focus on applying that on trying to, in a way, I don't know if enforce is the right word, incentivize applying them because they are already there. There has been done, like in the last years, there's been so much work.
Yeah, that was really wonderful. I think that's all the time that we have, unfortunately. But thank you all for your wonderful responses.